review. The elections just happened, and a lot went down. And so I'm here with Maggie. My name is Joel Grewe. If you haven't met me, I'm the Executive Director of HSLDA Action. Maggie is our lobbyist in DC, and her job is to keep a pulse on all things political in DC, which means she has a tall order. And with the elections just coming down, although not all of them quite being finished, we promised to give you guys a bit of a recap of what happened. So I'm going to caveat this right at the beginning. It's not quite done yet. Like, there's some counting that's not finished, and some of it's being a lot slower than it used to be, and I'm old enough to remember when I could go to bed and actually know how the election came out the night of, and apparently we're past that stage now. But we're going to see if we can recap some of what changed, what was up, what was at stake, what happened, and a bit of what we don't know yet, so there's some of that too. So with that, Maggie, before we get into the details of it, can you give our viewers just a little bit of what you do in DC for us? Obviously, you're going to know it better than I do.
Yeah, of course. So I'm technically the Federal Relations Liaison, which is just a fancy title for the lobbyist. So whenever there are bills we want to support, or bills we want to introduce, or bills we don't want to support, then I go and meet with our congressmen and their staff and talk to them about those issues. I also deal with whenever agencies pass rules that negatively affect homeschoolers. I go and try and get those fixed, and just basically make relationships and allies in DC with other like-minded groups to see how we can work together on the issues that we follow.
If you are part of the Congressional Action Program for HSLDA, you guys are part of our group of people that will come in and actually work with congressmen and senators, either in their district offices or, of course, in DC on Capitol Hill proper. Maggie is the point of the point of the spear that makes all of that happen and go forward, lays the groundwork, builds the framework for making that happen. So I want you to make sure you guys know her. She does a monthly email that we send out that has information on what's happening on Capitol Hill, issues that affect us. If you aren't signed up for that, please make sure you do. That's on the HSLDA Action website. So go to hsldaaction.org. You can sign up for our e-news there. We'd love to keep you in the loop. Thank you for being part of that. So with that out of the way, let's turn to the election itself. Maggie, what was at stake? There was a lot of stuff going on.
There was a lot of stuff. So just raw numbers of what was on the map. At the federal level, a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. So that means we had 35 Senate seats that were up for election this year. 14 of those were held by Democrats before the election. 21 were held by Republicans. Prior to the midterms, we had a 50-50 Senate. So both sides were looking to try and pick up a few seats to try and make sure it wasn't 50-50. So we had that. On the House side, every member of the House of Representatives is up for election every other year. So we had all 435 seats up for election. Prior to the midterms, the Democrats had 220 seats. The Republicans had 212. And if you're doing math, you realize that's not exactly 435 because there were 3 vacancies that were also up for election. So the Republicans only needed to pick up a handful of seats to take the majority, so that was their goal heading into the election. And then at the state level, there were also 36 gubernatorial seats up for election.
That's a lot of gubernatorial seats.
It was a lot. It was a lot.
Is that normal for cycle, or were there special elections involved in that too? I don't actually remember.
I think it's normal. A few states like Virginia and New Jersey have off-year elections, but I think most of them are in a midterm cycle.
All right. Well, that's a lot. Oh, then, but there was more than just that at stake, right? We also had. Sorry. Do you want to walk through some of the different ballot initiatives that were running around?
Yeah. So, in addition to just the raw numbers of races, there were also a lot of issues on the ballots. So, I'm only going to focus on the issues that we here at HSLDA track because, like immigration, the economy, and all of that we'll let other groups handle. But we track, education, parental rights, and the life issue. So education obviously has been a really hot topic the past few years thanks to COVID, which really highlighted all of the issues in the public schools and has really just exposed how important the education issue is. So you have one side who is pushing for more school choice, more ways for families to pursue something other than the public school system, and then you have the other side who is doubling down and trying to increase regulation, trying to keep kids in the public school. So we had that on the ballot. We had parental rights, which, like education, is a really hot issue at the moment. You have one side who is trying to separate kids from their parents and saying that parents shouldn't have a role in their kids' education or in their upbringing, and you have the other side who is saying the opposite things, that parental rights are very important. And we at HSLDA recognize that parental rights is the most fundamental issue when it comes to homeschool freedom. So that's a very important issue that was on the ballot this year.
You can't really do the homeschooling thing without parental rights.
No, it's kind of difficult.
It really makes it hard. So if you that is one of the things that we go to the mat for regularly, because it is foundational, right? Mm-hmm. That's a good word for that. All right, so that's what was at stake.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there is one more issue.
Oh.
The life issue.
Right, of course.
So that's an issue that we don't talk about much here at HSLDA, just because we recognize there are a lot of other groups who really make it their issue, and so we let them do what they do best. But it is an issue we find extremely important. Every candidate that we endorse has to be publicly pro-life. So that is an issue we track, and that was obviously on the ballot this year, thanks to the Dobbs decision that came out this summer.
There was quite the flurry of activity if you followed that, and a lot of passion that got poured into that issue across the nation. I mean, how many different life initiatives on that issue? There were at least like half a dozen, something like that.
Yeah, there were at least six.
At least six
States that had.
All right, so that was what was at stake.
Yeah.
Okay. State elections, over half of them for the gubernatorial control, plus, of course, the full House and a third of the Senate, and then all the ballot stuff. Which then brings to the important question, the reason you're all here. What happened?
Well, so really for the most part, we maintained status quo. Midterms are usually seen as a big change election, and there's usually some kind of pushback against whatever party has power in the White House. Both Democrat and Republican administrations usually experience this, and we just didn't really see that this year. In the Senate, at least 27 of the 28 incumbents won their races. We're still waiting on Georgia.
Right.
Stayed the same. In the House, it looks like, again, we're still counting some races.
Fair.
But it looks like 356 of 365 incumbents up for election won re-election.
So does that mean that basically those, for the lack of better terms, like those districts where they tried to do the district reorientation, they basically made those districts harder blue or red, okay, less likely to shift?
Yes, it depends. It does depend.
Okay.
I think New York is a notable exception.
Fair enough.
Where the Republicans picked up 4 seats that used to be deep blue.
Oregon also
yeah,
had a bit of a surprise coming out of there. I noticed that.
Florida had a few of those seats too.
Florida went very good, it seems.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough.
But for the most part, this was the year of the incumbent.
All right, fair enough. Okay, so that's what happened. The House.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, we don't know everything.
Right.
And that, I think, should stabilize in the next couple days. Hopefully by the time we're done with the Senate in Georgia.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Oh,
all right. What about the Senate then? What about, what else happens?
So governors, 27 of the 28 won their incumbency. So at the Senate right now, again, we're still waiting on Georgia, but it looks like we're either going to have a 50-50 Senate or a 51-49 in favor of the Democrats in the Senate.
Okay.
And in the House, it does look like we're still waiting on some of those races.
And then certification takes a week or two after they're done with the count, right?
Right. But it does look like the Republicans are going to have a slim majority in the House.
So we're going to be back to essentially divided government.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, so what does the impact of divided government mean for us?
Well, for us, limited government types, it's actually not a bad thing. They're not going to really be able to pass any legislation because the Republicans will have the House, the Democrats will have the Senate, and you need both houses of Congress to vote on bills in order to pass it, and that's just not going to happen the next coming year, which means they can't really pass anything bad, which is great.
But it also means they don't pass anything functionally.
No, not really.
So there's very minimal actual productive work being done.
Right.
So what you're telling me sounds like what we're seeing is basically a deeper entrenchment of partisanship relative to the current operations. It means blue states became more blue, red states became more red, as a rule, a few notable exceptions in a couple areas. And the battle lines were dug deeper rather than moving.
Right.
Yeah? Okay.
Right.
All right. What about the ballot issues?
So the life issue was on the ballot in 6 different states. They were all a little bit different. California, Michigan, and Vermont all voted to make abortion a constitutional right in their state. Kentucky rejected a measure that would have ensured abortion was not a constitutional right. And probably the most surprising one was Montana, which actually voted to not require health care to babies born alive.
That one surprised me.
Yeah, that one was pretty rough.
Okay.
But I think something that really contributed to all of this going the way we did not want them to go was that Democrats spent nearly half of all of their election spending was on the abortion issue.
Really?
It was almost $500 million spent just on abortion ads.
Wow, which of course was relative to the candidates, but it was also relative to the ballot initiatives.
Yeah.
Okay, would you say that this is probably the direction the country is going, or is this more like kind of the fervent response to the Dobbs decision and all the instability that created nationally as a result of moving it down to 50 different states?
I think part of it is the Dobbs decision. You know, we love that the Dobbs decision happened, of course, but we knew that there was a risk sending it back to the states because now the states can decide what they want to do.
Right.
But I also think a lot of it is some misinformation, because we know that when polling is done, most Americans actually support some form of restriction on abortion.
Right.
And these ballot initiatives don't reflect that. And so I think all of that ad spending kind of led to misinformation and people not realizing what they were actually voting on, what these initiatives were actually going to do.
Fair
so
enough.
I don't think it's reflective of the actual opinion of the American people.
But it's at least it's probably the flash response to Dobbs, at least in part, but also a lot of money getting poured into that.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
I know it's been a topic of discussion within the political circles across the states at the local level, because all of a sudden it's relevant, and it wasn't before. So there's been a lot of discussion and fervor and kind of diagnostics on that didn't exist or was not relevant.
Yeah.
It was all theoretical up until now it's real.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah.
And that has created all sorts of interesting battle lines. So that, you think that's contributing to the partisan entrenchment?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it definitely ended up being a bigger issue than we expected it was going to be.
Fair enough. Okay. All right. Well, let's circle back around to Congress, because that's really kind of our wheelhouse. We don't usually do a lot in the gubernatorial elections or in the policy issues at the state level, but we definitely focus on the federal. What do you think happens relative to the parental rights issue, relative to family law, relative to educational freedom at the House? With a razor-thin margin, we've moved into something that's very tight. Is that good or bad for our issues in discussion, in raising them, in negotiating them?
So I actually think it's a good thing. So they're not going to be able to focus on a lot of legislation. There is some, and we can talk about that in a bit. But what the House is really going to focus on in the coming 2 years are investigations. Those are going to be the name of the game. Because when they can't do legislation, they can investigate.
Okay.
And one of the issues the past few years was COVID policies in the schools, and also the Department of Justice going after parents who chose to go to school board meetings.
That was the school board mess, right?
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Loudoun County had one of them,
Exactly.
or a couple of them. Yep, right where we are here.
Yes.
Okay.
So we know the House is going to launch investigations into those issues,
Okay.
and I think that's great for parental rights because it's going to expose what some of these bad actors in the government have been doing against parents.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second, because it's probably a little weird if you're watching this and you're like, this is Homeschool Legal Defense Association action, and now we're talking about school boards.
Yeah.
Why do we care?
Because school boards do have the power to regulate homeschooling at the local level.
In most states, I think,
Yeah.
yes. Okay.
Yeah.
It seems maybe a little odd for HSLDA to care a lot about what happens at a school board, but it does have significant intersection with homeschool freedom. And your ability to have your voice heard and to be able to speak your piece there and to make sure that those school boards respect homeschooling freedom matters a lot. And if it becomes a freedom of speech thing at a certain point, and that matters, your ability to have your voice in government.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's investigations.
Yes.
Okay? But we're not seeing legislative action.
We're going to see some in the House. We're going to see some introduction of legislation.
Okay, but not something you're expecting to make it through both
No,
sides. Not
no.
like it.
One of those bills is the Parental Rights Amendment, which is introduced by our friends over at parentalrights.org.
Right.
They just introduced it before the election. We knew it wasn't going to go anywhere, but they did that so that it would be primed and ready to go to be reintroduced in January. So they already have a sponsor. We already know that's going to go ahead and be introduced.
So let me dig on that for a second,
Yeah.
because unless you're a legislative nerd, and even when you are a legislative nerd, sometimes you're like, why introduce something that's not going anywhere? Do you just introduce legislation if you've got a chance going through? Do you not do it? What's the strategy kind of involved in multiple introductions of legislation? Because you see this, where bills get introduced every single year, knowing they're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Why do you do that?
Well, so it's for several reasons. One reason is a conversation starter. It gets people talking about it if there's a bill out there to be talked about. Another reason is most bills do have to be introduced several times before they can get passed in order to gather sponsors and supporters, in order to iron out the language to get all of the different groups to support it happy, to have the correct language. So there's a lot of different reasons to do it. If you just introduce it the first time, it's probably not going to go anywhere because it doesn't have any support. No one knows what it is.
So that's part of the support building process.
Exactly.
And refinement.
Right.
Okay. Well, what a novel thought. It takes time to refine laws until it's something that's actually palatable. That actually sounds oddly like good government.
Right.
Ironically, I mean, I think that's supposed to be the Senate, right? It's supposed to slow things down and kind of make sure. But okay, whatever. We'll take what we can get here.
Yeah.
Careful and deliberative legislation that has thought through the implications.
Yeah, it's these 1,000-page bills that get introduced at the last minute and then are voted on the week after they're introduced that we really have serious problems.
And no one read them.
Right, because you can't.
Right. I mean, what was that infamous line? You have to pass the bill so you can read the bill to know what's in it.
Yes.
I don't feel like that's good governance.
No.
Okay, if we have to do it in a more deliberative fashion, I think that's better for everyone involved.
Yeah.
I know there's been more than one incident where like, wait, no, you can't do that because thing. I know we had a call here a couple weeks ago of someone working on a piece of legislation. They're like, hey, we want you to review this. We won't say what it is, but they were like, we want you to review this to make sure that what we're working on here is okay. And then that took us a week or two to kind of chew through it and make sure, okay, we're good with this. This is fine. It's not trampling on any of our concerns. We appreciate, by the way, the courtesy. If you're watching this and you happen to be writing legislation, if you want to give it to us in advance to get our feedback, we'd love to help you with that. Like,
I love when that happens.
It's really nice because then we're like, yep, don't need to worry about that. They've already seen it. We've highlighted the issues to be aware of. We've said, yes, that's good or not. So that's always good. We also, for the record, HSLDA will also help with that at a state level, if you're working at that too. We are glad to review legislation. I'm involved in that here in Virginia on occasion, and we have these nights we'll sit down and go through 150 pieces of legislation with a team of people and chew through it to make sure that we've thought about the implications of that. So that is one of the things that we provide at HSLDA and HSLDA Action at a federal and at a state level. So. Side note, but I figure it's worth noting because if you're watching this, you're probably involved or have a higher likelihood of being involved in something like that than most people. So, all right. We've talked a little bit about this for like what the impact is legislatively. Right? Is there stuff that we're watching coming up relative to Congress that we're like, hey, we should keep an eye on this. This is something that might be moving. We talked about the parental rights legislation. Anything else?
So there were a few school choice bills introduced the past 2 years. There's no certainty on if those are going to be reintroduced or not. There are certainly conversations happening about any school choice legislation people would like to introduce, but nothing for sure. And part of that is the fact that it is a split Congress.
Do you think there's any appetite? I mean, it doesn't take much to tilt it one way or the other in the Senate to get you to 51 or 52 votes. Of course, there's that 60 vote margin that we have to get to. Can we take a moment and explain why you don't need just a simple majority to move stuff through the Senate very much right now?
Yeah, so...
Sorry, I'm going off script. Fair warning, okay? Yeah.
So the Senate is a more deliberative body, which means it has a higher threshold in order to pass legislation. You know, the House is pretty much majority rules, but the Senate is not. So they have this thing called the filibuster. So you have to reach 60 votes. It's a much higher threshold, much more difficult to pass legislation.
Now, what's the upside to that?
The upside is that you can't just ram through bad legislation, theoretically.
With a narrow margin.
Exactly. Yeah.
The downside is that it moves really slow.
Yeah.
But it also means that if each party is basically at 50, neither of them functionally have controlling majorities to get anything substantive through. Like there's a few loopholes you can get a few things through, but to do anything substantive, you're going to need a fairly broad coalition that will be a bipartisan issue to make it through, which means the only stuff we're expecting to move through the Senate is going to be bipartisan stuff. Right. I'm assuming essentially government funding bills, budget
the stuff they have to pass.
The stuff they have to pass. And they don't always even do that, for the record. We've had a few incidents. Okay, so there's that. With all of that being said, there's one major aspect actually two major aspects of government, but one big one that we haven't talked about yet. And that's the executive.
Yeah.
They weren't on the ballot. Biden wasn't on the ballot. His administration wasn't on the ballot. In a sense he was. But by name, he wasn't. With a divided government and a Senate that's not moving stuff unless it's absolutely essential, you've got your 60 vote threshold minimum you're going to be able to do major legislation through, and a bunch of incumbent entrenchment. What does that mean for us relative to the executive? Can we talk about like what the impact of that is relative to the three branches?
Yes.
For a second?
Yeah. So first part of that is this coming November and December means we're in a lame duck Congress.
Right.
And what that means is it's the Congress between a midterm and a new congressional session. So we have a lot of retiring members or a lot of members who lost their election who will not be coming back in January and are no longer really accountable to their constituents. So the administration.
How terrifying.
I know.
Wow. That's always interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the
Is that
administration.
good or bad right now?
It's not good.
That's
It's
not good. Okay, fair enough.
That's not good.
Okay.
So the administration's really going to push hard for their top priorities to pass through Congress before the end of the year.
So we need to be on guard for at least the next 2 months.
Right.
Okay.
So,
good to know.
Yeah. Fortunately, there's not any education-related bills, but there are some concerning bills out there.
I've seen a few that have crossed my
Yeah,
desk where I'm like, wait,
it's
what?
not good.
That they're trying to move. Okay.
Yeah, it's not good.
Okay.
And then at the administration level, for the next 2 years, they're really going to operate by executive order because they're not going to be able to get anything through Congress, so they're just going to do it from the West Wing.
Lovely. Okay.
Yeah.
So that gets thrown around a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What an executive order is, what it can do.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us like the barest of primer on that for
Yeah.
just a moment? Like, at some point, I think we need to come around and actually do a session for you guys on explaining how executive orders work, because that has become a dominant aspect
It is.
of federal regulatory rulemaking,
Yeah.
impacts your life, government, except that it's not law.
Yeah.
It's something else.
Yeah, so we really have a fourth branch of government that we don't teach in schools, and it's called the bureaucracy.
It used to be the press. Now it's the bureaucracy. So maybe that was okay. Very good.
Yeah, because Congress used to have a lot more power, and in modern years has really ceded a lot of its governing power. So now a lot of it comes from the executive branch, and so executive orders really don't have a lot of rules around them that really aren't talked a whole lot about in the Constitution. So the White House can really write rules about whatever they want to, and the president signs it, and then it goes to the agencies to implement.
So these are directives to agencies.
These are directives to agencies.
They're not like a directive to you at home.
No.
They're a directive to a federal agency. But
Right.
that agency has power.
The agency has a lot of power.
Okay?
Right.
And that's where it comes and can actually
Right.
bump into you.
Right. Now, Congress can come in and repeal these executive orders or curtail them in some way.
Okay?
But as we've talked about,
So there is some sort of review mechanism.
There is.
But in a divided Congress, it's
Right.
probably it requires both chambers to review and say no, right?
Right.
Not just one.
Right. And a following president can come in and just
Put it back.
erase- Exactly.
Well, we see that with the Mexico City policy.
Right.
Like, depending on which president is in office, on, off,
Yes.
on, off. It's just like this
Yeah.
toggle switch that goes back and forth. And there's a stack of them, they just go through and sign every time. Okay, that makes sense. That's part of how we got to the school board issue. Like, there was aspects of, like, the president said, FBI, do this. And the FBI said, okay. And there's, like, that agency has a lot of power. And then it was directed
Right.
by the White House. Okay. On that note of the investigations for a minute, do we expect to see that actually percolate down to like our local level? Like, what do those investigations look like there? Like, is that, we talked about that a little bit, but is that going to be something that actually like hits us on like how we live our life, what happens at our county, like our county school board level? Is that going to like heat it up, cool it down, and actually show up at our door for some reason? Like,
Yeah, it's not really something homeschool families have to be concerned about. It's going to put a spotlight on school board members and how they are treating families and parents. Probably encourage them to behave a little better these next few years.
better behavior's good. Doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, better behavior's good.
Exactly. But homeschool families don't really have to expect their lives to change at all.
Okay. All right. So that part where you don't expect to have any real serious impact.
Yeah.
All right. That being said, okay, one of the things that probably, well, always matters, okay, is our ability to maintain relationships with our electeds, and we work on that with people on both sides of the aisle. Okay. Homeschooling is something that there are plenty of Democrats and Republicans who support. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's good.
Yes.
Okay, because we believe it's actually good for everyone, no matter your political stripe. Okay. I think sometimes people forget that homeschooling as a function was basically this alliance of really conservative folks and hippies.
Yeah.
And that's where it came. I had a
Yeah.
friend of mine, he's like, you're homeschooling, and I grew up in the hippie generation. I'm kind of like, well, you realize that like homeschooling actually was this beautiful partnership of both sides going, actually, we think freedom's better. And that's true, and we still believe that. It's one of the reasons we have people from all sorts of spectrums and backgrounds and perspectives that all happily get together and say homeschooling's good. Now, on that note, though, one of the things that's important is that our electeds, our legislators, even maybe some of the bureaucrats, know and are familiar with and aware of and have good relationships with people who homeschool. Part of what HSLE Action does is we run something called the Congressional Action Program. You probably are familiar with that if you're watching this, but if one of your friends sent this over and said, hey, watch this, let me explain what that is. The Congressional Action Program is a program of HSLDA Action that basically encourages, supports, families that are currently homeschool building relationships with their electeds. Okay, in DC proper, like on the Hill. Okay, but also in their home districts in the states. Okay, now there's value to both sides of that. Okay. It is uncommon, when I worked on the Hill as well, when people came in from the district to my office, the one I was working at, and the office I was in at that point was Oklahoma, one of the Oklahoma congressional offices. Someone walked in from the district, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, someone from home is here, and we roll out the red carpet, we want to hear what you want to say, we want to have conversations with you, we're going to take you and give you tours, and like, because you are the people that we represent in that case. Okay. Well, when you walk in and say, hi, I'm here from insert state, and everyone's like, oh, you're from the district, okay? You're the people we're actually accountable to, okay? You know, the congressman from Minnesota or New York or Nebraska, they don't answer to the people of Oregon or Texas or Florida. They answer to people from their home district. And so we intentionally want to build relationships between people who live in their districts, okay, and the people that represent them. That is healthy. It also means that when you show up and say, hey, that bill you're working on actually is going to directly harm me, okay? Or that really matters for my freedom, that's a really good bill, please make sure that moves forward. There's much more weight applied to that. Now, about a year and a half ago or so, give or take, a little bit, we did our first congressional action, basically since post-COVID. In fact, we discovered later that it was the very first, like, in person with real citizens, like normal people showing up on Capitol Hill, knocking on doors and meeting congressmen. We were the first people back after COVID, which we were just trying to get it done. We didn't know we were going to be first, but we'll take that too, okay? Yeah. And a bunch of you helped making that happen, and that was amazing. Okay? We're looking at our next one being not quite as cold. So instead of doing it in December and January area, we're looking at putting it actually in this coming April. Now, registration's not set yet. We have a bunch of details that have to be figured out, but we're looking at April for the next Congressional Action Program event in DC. We're also looking at some other activities that will be done in the state level. That won't be us in person. We can't fly out to all the states as we do this, but we're going to be trying to support you guys in that as well. We'd love to have your partnership with this. If you are not part of the Congressional Action Program and you're a homeschool family and you're interested, please sign up for more information on our website. Again, hsldaction.org. There's all the information you want there. You can sign up as a member. We'd really love you to be a member. It's a nominal cost, but it helps cover the work and expense and everything from the policy reviews to the information material we hand out to the staff teams we have that help keep homeschooling free at a federal level. Okay, so please join if you're not a member. If you are and you want to be part of the CAP program, you're interested in applying for that, applications for that are online as well. One other thing we didn't mention, and we probably should at least a little bit, is that we have we're almost out at this point. We're about to have to republish the thing. We do a booklet called What is Homeschooling? And for most of you, you're like, well, I know what homeschooling is. Yes, I know. Okay. If you're on this, you probably are well familiar with what is homeschooling, and that's a good thing. Okay. However, you'd be amazed how many people in government and in media, for that matter, don't. Okay. We routinely have conversations with members of the press, members of media, members of government, okay, who are generally aware of homeschooling. In fact, they often usually have friends who are homeschooled, but they didn't know that until later. That's always a funny moment where you're like, yeah, that person there that's good friends with you is homeschooled. And they're like, well, they look so normal. Yeah, I know. Okay. That being said, we do a booklet every 2 years, every Congress. So we're going to be building another one for next year that's entitled What is Homeschooling? And it's designed to be a review of homeschooling at a policy level and how it's good for society. Not just good for your kids. We already know that. Like, we're sold on that. That part's easy. This is why homeschooling is good for America. Okay? Why it's good for our schools, why it's good for our budgets, why it's good for our civil society, why it's good for civics and citizenship, and what it is, and the impact that has, and what the regulatory components of that are at a federal level. We publish that every 2 years. Okay, so we're looking at doing it with the new Congress. That'll take a little bit to get going. We expect that hopefully for spring. We have a few of the other ones left. If you have friends or you have legislators you're working with, you're like, hey, I want you to know more about this. We've actually designed a resource specifically for electeds and media. Okay. It's not you, mom, how to homeschool, you, dad, how to homeschool your kids. We've got those too. HSLDA's got lots of that. But if you want to give to someone who doesn't actually know, okay, and they're like, so this homeschooling thing, people were talking about it, a bunch of people did it during COVID, yeah, a bunch of them still are. This is the information you need to equip them to make intelligent decisions on that subject matter. Okay, so if you're interested, let us know. Reach out to us. There's contact information for us on the website. You can ask for that. We have at least some left in our remaining stockpile. We'd be glad to give that out before we publish the new one. And if we give them all out, then we'll put you on the list for distribution for the next batch of it. So that being said, thank you so much for joining us. Maggie, thanks for dropping by.
Thank you.
She's normally in DC proper, so she comes out to HQ periodically to sit down so we can have an in-person conversation. Thanks for watching. I hope that was helpful. If you've got questions, comments, insight, please send it to us. Again, the contact information is at hsldaction.org. We'd love to have your support and we'd love to have your feedback. Thanks so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.